In 1969, something happened that left the military, the police, and even local townspeople in complete shock. A disappearance so unusual, so haunting, that even after years of searching, no one could explain where the truth had gone. This is not just a story. It's a mystery that kept investigators restless for nearly a decade. Stay with me until the very end, because what happened will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about vanishing cases. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss more mysteries like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Drop your city name below. The story begins on the morning of June 18, 1969, at Fort Irwin, a massive training ground tucked in the desert stretches of San Bernardino County, California. The base had been running round-the-clock exercises to prepare young soldiers for the worsening war in Vietnam. It was a place of constant noise, the rumble of engines, the echoes of explosions, and the sharp whistle of commands. But within the order of military life, something strange happened that no one saw coming. At 4:47 a.m., according to the official logs, a tank crew was scheduled to report to the motor pool for maintenance checks. Among them was Specialist First Class David Hartwell, a 26-year-old tank operator who had earned the trust of his commander for his precision behind the controls of an M60 Patton. Hartwell wasn't a man who drew much attention to himself. By most accounts, he was quiet, neat, and disciplined, the kind of soldier who did what he was told without complaint. He didn't stand out as reckless, nor was he ever flagged for disciplinary issues. But on that morning, something shifted. The official motor pool ledger showed Hartwell's signature at 5:03 a.m., confirming he had checked out his assigned vehicle for inspection. This was routine. What wasn't routine was that, by 6:12 a.m., the same M60 tank was no longer anywhere on the grounds. No orders had been issued for its movement, no training operation required its departure, and no one recalled seeing it leave. The massive tank, weighing more than 50 tons, had vanished. Along with it, so had Specialist Hartwell. Military investigators scrambled within the hour. At first, there was disbelief. It was almost unthinkable that a vehicle that large could slip away unnoticed from a base where movement was constantly tracked. The gates were monitored, the desert terrain surrounding the facility was vast but open, and the engines of a Patton tank were deafening, carrying across miles. Yet, no guard reported seeing it cross the perimeter, and no listening post logged the roar of its engine leaving. The first suspicion was desertion. The late 1960s were a turbulent time in America, and soldiers abandoning their posts to avoid deployment in Vietnam was not unheard of. But desertion usually meant fleeing quietly, without drawing attention. Taking a 50-ton tank with you? That was something else entirely. A search began immediately. By midday on June 18th, helicopters swept across the Mojave Desert, combing ridges, dry lake beds, and old mining trails that spiderwebbed into the mountains. Tracks from the tank should have been obvious, deep cuts in the sand that could not be mistaken for anything else. Yet no such tracks were discovered leaving the compound. Inside the base, investigators retraced every possible path. They found the tank garage bay door rolled open, with the lock unbroken, as if opened with the proper key. The bay floor showed signs that the tank had indeed been driven out. But once it reached the hard-packed sand of the base's outer yard, the trail stopped. No clear direction. No heavy marks of 50 tons dragging away. It was as if the machine had simply driven into thin air. Rumors spread quickly among the enlisted men. Some whispered that Hartwell had snapped, that the stress of looming deployment had driven him into madness, and he'd tried to make an impossible escape. Others claimed sabotage, that maybe the Soviets had found a way to infiltrate and steal American hardware, using Hartwell as either an accomplice or a pawn. In 1969, with Cold War paranoia at its peak, such theories did not feel far-fetched. The official line, however, was controlled silence. The Army never issued a public press release about the missing tank. Instead, families of soldiers stationed at Fort Irwin received vague reassurances about an equipment discrepancy under review. To keep morale intact and prevent a flood of questions, commanders classified the matter and limited discussion to internal reports. But behind the scenes, an investigation of unusual intensity was underway. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division dispatched agents to interview every soldier who had spoken to Hartwell in the days leading up to June 18th. Most described him as steady, if somewhat distant. He wrote letters to his mother in Illinois regularly, never hinting at distress. He didn't drink heavily or gamble, unlike many of his peers. He had no girlfriend on record, no significant disciplinary actions, no pending courts-martial. The only odd note came from a fellow operator, Private Raymond Dorsey, who recalled Hartwell mentioning something the night before. According to Dorsey, Hartwell had said quietly, "If I ever drive one of these out of here, nobody will find it again." Dorsey assumed it was a joke. Now it sounded like a warning. On June 19th, less than 48 hours after the disappearance, military police widened their search zone to include civilian roads that branched away from the desert. A tank on a highway would have been impossible to miss, and yet no local authorities reported anything of the sort. Highway patrol officers, gas station attendants, and small-town sheriffs across in Bernardino County were questioned. Not one sighting. The desert remained quiet, empty, and glaringly featureless. The first breakthrough came not from the desert, but from paperwork. During a sweep of base storage rooms, investigators found that Hartwell had checked out additional supplies from the quartermaster 2 days prior. Ration packs, water cans, and a tarpaulin large enough to drape over machinery. On its own, it might not have seemed unusual. But given what happened, it suggested premeditation. He hadn't just taken the tank. He had prepared to be gone. Still, one problem persisted: the fuel. An M60 Patton consumed massive amounts of diesel. Fully loaded, its fuel capacity allowed for a maximum range of about 300 miles on flat ground. Even if Hartwell had escaped undetected, the tank couldn't simply keep going forever. Somewhere out there, it would need to stop, refuel, or be abandoned. Yet every passing day yielded no wreckage, no abandoned hull, no signs of resupply theft. On June 25th, nearly a week after the disappearance, an Air Force reconnaissance plane scanning the desert floor near Death Valley spotted what looked like faint parallel tracks cutting through a dry basin. Ground teams were dispatched. What they found unsettled everyone further. The tracks were wide and deep, matching what a 50-ton tank might leave. They stretched for nearly 2 miles before ending abruptly at the base of a rocky bluff. But at the cliffside, the trail stopped. No continuation, no turn, no sign the tank had doubled back. The parallel ruts simply vanished at the stone face, as though the vehicle had been swallowed by the earth itself. Teams rappelled down the bluff, thinking maybe the tank had plunged into a ravine. Nothing. No wreckage, no debris, no disturbed hockey. Just silence and desert wind. The official log of the investigation notes the event but offers no explanation. By July, the search was scaled back. Helicopters still made occasional sweeps, but the case had begun to resemble something worse than desertion. It looked like a failure the Army could not explain. Records were sealed, and Hartwell was quietly listed as AWOL, then later as a deserter. To the public, his name never appeared in newspapers, and his mother received only a curt letter noting that her son had failed to report for duty. For most, the story ended there. But 9 years later, in the summer of 1978, everything changed. It was August 4th, a blistering afternoon near the Nevada border. A group of hikers exploring the edge of the Ivampa Valley stumbled across a strange sight partially hidden by sand and scrub. The hulking frame of a tank, weathered by years of desert sun, sat lodged against a dry wash. Its paint was bleached, its surface scarred by sandstorms, but the serial numbers were intact. It was unmistakably the same M60 Patton that had vanished in 1969. The tank was sealed. The hatches were closed. When officials finally pried them open days later, they found the interior coated in dust, the instruments corroded, the compartments empty. No body, no supplies, no sign of struggle. But there was one detail that stood out. The ignition keys were still in place, and the fuel gauge, though frozen from rust, was stuck at nearly full, meaning Wherever the tank had been all those years, it hadn't run itself dry in the desert. It had been brought there deliberately and left. And Specialist First Class David Hartwell was never seen again. The discovery of the missing M60 patent tank in August of 1978 should have brought closure. For nearly a decade, whispers had swirled within certain military circles and among families of those who served at Fort Irwin about the disappearance of Specialist First Class David Hartwell and his 50-ton machine. But when the tank emerged from the sand like a ghost from the past, the mystery only grew deeper. It was a group of civilian hikers who stumbled upon it, near an arid wash that cut across the Ivampa Valley, less than 20 miles from the Nevada state line. At first, they thought it was some sort of movie prop, abandoned after a war film shoot. But the closer they came, the more details they noticed. The Army stenciling, the faint, weather-beaten serial numbers, the smell of rust and oil still clinging to the desert air. They reported the find to local authorities, and soon the Army was notified. On August 10th, a recovery team arrived. Photographs taken during the operation, some of which were later leaked in fragments to newspapers, showed the tank sitting at an awkward angle, as if it had been positioned deliberately to face the horizon. Sand and sagebrush had partly swallowed its tracks, but underneath, the ground was surprisingly undisturbed. There were no deep ruts carved into the basin, no evidence of the long, grinding journey a machine of that size would have made across open desert. It was as if the vehicle had been dropped there. When Army investigators pried open the hatches, they expected at least the skeletal remains of Hartwell. Instead, they found nothing but emptiness and silence. The inside was coated with a layer of fine desert dust, so thick it seemed almost unnatural, as if the tank had been abandoned for centuries rather than years. There was no food, no rations, no water containers, not even a trace of personal belongings. The ignition was the most haunting detail. The keys were still in place, turned to the off position, as if whoever had last operated the tank had parked it neatly and then stepped out, never to return. Even stranger was the fuel gauge. Though corroded, its needle was locked just below the full mark. The tank, by every measurable detail, should have been able to drive hundreds of miles. Yet no one had ever reported seeing it travel, and no fuel thefts were ever recorded in the region during those missing years. Forensic teams scraped the inner surfaces for biological traces. They found none. No fingerprints beyond Hartwell's older records. No hair, no blood, no signs of struggle. It was as if the man who had taken the tank had been erased. By late August, the Army had cordoned off the area, loading the tank onto a flatbed carrier and transporting it to the Yermo Annex for further examination. Local newspapers caught wind of the story, but official statements were deliberately vague. The Los Angeles Times reported simply that a decommissioned military vehicle had been recovered from the desert. The Army avoided naming Hartwell, avoided the word vanished, and instead leaned on the phrase resolved equipment discrepancy. But within the barracks and among the veterans, whispers returned with more force than ever. The strangest twist came from the hikers themselves. During interviews with investigators, they described how the tank appeared oddly clean despite being left in the desert. Yes, its paint was faded, and yes, rust had crept across its edges. But the sand beneath it was oddly compact, as though it had been settled there long before winds could bury its weight. Even more unsettling, two of the hikers swore they had seen what looked like fresh scuff marks along one side of the hull, marks like hands or boots had rubbed against it recently. When questioned again, one hiker recanted, saying perhaps the desert light had played tricks on them. But the other insisted. Investigators documented the claim, but did not pursue it further. By September of 1978, the case was reopened quietly within Army Criminal Investigation Division files. They assigned a new officer to lead the inquiry, Major Paul Donovan, a meticulous career investigator who had handled several high-profile desertion cases during the Vietnam era. Donovan was known for his patience, for chasing down leads that others dismissed. His first order of business was to revisit the original 1969 disappearance records. He noted something peculiar almost immediately. The tank's trail, discovered back then near a rocky bluff, had never been explained. The official report claimed the tracks ended at the cliffside and could not be followed further. Donovan requested fresh aerial surveys of that same area, hoping 9 years later the desert might have shifted and revealed something new. What the photos revealed unsettled him. The faint tracks, though weathered, were still visible in the stone and sand. They ended at the cliff, just as the old reports had said. But satellite imagery showed something else, an unusual indentation in the rock wall itself, partially concealed by shadows. It looked like an unnatural opening, as if machinery had once disturbed the face of the stone. Donovan filed for a ground survey, but before he could assemble his team, he was ordered by higher command to stand down. His superiors classified the aerial images and restricted access, citing national security. Donovan kept copies in his private files, convinced there was more to the cliffside than had been admitted. While Donovan pursued his suppressed lead, another piece of evidence emerged. A retired radio operator from Fort Irwin, a man named James Leland, stepped forward after hearing about the recovered tank in passing conversation. He claimed that on the night of June 18th, 1969, the base's comms had briefly picked up an unusual transmission. It was short, garbled, and never officially logged. According to Leland, the message had sounded like Hartwell's voice, saying only 2 words, "still moving." Then silence. Leland's claim could not be verified. No recording existed, and no one else remembered it. But Donovan filed it anyway. Meanwhile, forensic examiners at the Yermo Annex dug deeper into the tank's condition. They discovered something that chilled even the most skeptical officers. On the interior side of the hatch, beneath the layers of dust, faint scratches were etched into the metal. They were not random marks, but deliberate, almost like someone had tried to carve letters or numbers with a knife or key. The scratches were shallow and incomplete, but a few shapes were distinguishable. The number 11, the word down, and something that looked like a half-finished R. Theories exploded within Donovan's circle. Had Hartwell tried to leave a message? Was 11 down a location, a warning, or something else entirely? The incomplete R drove Donovan in particular into long nights of speculation. Run? Rock? Room? Rescue? What puzzled everyone most was the time gap. Where had the tank been for 9 years? If Hartwell had stolen it and hidden it, why leave it so close to Fort Irwin? Why abandon it fully fueled, keys intact, with no trace of a body? And how could something so massive go unseen for so long in a desert crisscrossed by training missions, highway patrols, and aerial flights? The civilian press began to catch wind of the strangeness. Small local papers in Barstow and Victorville ran stories under headlines like "Ghost Tank Found in Desert" and "Army Mystery Reopened." Veterans speculated in letters to the editor, and conspiracy theories began to grow. Some said Hartwell had been recruited by secret programs. Others whispered about UFOs, about government cover-ups, about the desert hiding more than anyone admitted. But the most unsettling testimonies came from locals who, emboldened by the news, recalled strange sightings from the late 1960s and early 1970s. One rancher, in a sworn statement to investigators, claimed that in July of 1970, he had seen a massive vehicle moving slowly across a ridge at dusk. He said it looked like a tank, though he had dismissed it at the time, thinking it was part of Army maneuvers. But according to his memory, the vehicle moved in absolute silence. No roaring engine, no grinding tracks. Just a hulking shadow sliding across the desert floor before vanishing behind a ridge. Another witness, a truck driver who often hauled freight between Las Vegas and Barstow, reported that sometime in 1973, while pulled over on an isolated stretch, he had seen lights flickering in the desert far from the road. They looked like the flashes of a welding torch or machinery being worked on. He'd assumed it was miners. But when investigators asked him to pinpoint the location, it lined up disturbingly close to the same rocky bluff where Hartwell's tracks had ended. By late 1978, Donovan was convinced that the tank had not simply been abandoned where it was found. He believed it had been moved there deliberately, perhaps recently, to make it appear as though it had sat untouched for years. The sand, the compact ground, the odd scuff marks, all pointed to something more active. He filed a report to his superiors suggesting the tank had been staged. But again, his findings were quietly sealed. The Army officially closed a reopened case in December 1978, labeling Hartwell presumed dead. His family was given a final letter of condolence. But Donovan did not stop digging. In early 1979, he confided in a colleague that he intended to return to the rocky bluff on his own, outside official orders. He believed something lay hidden in that cliff face, something connected not just to the tank, but to Hartwell himself. He never filed a follow-up report. What happened in that desert after 1979 remains one of the strangest and most unsettling unsolved mysteries of the Cold War era. And yet, evidence continued to surface in ways no one could predict. Because in 1982, a family camping near the Nevada border reported finding something half buried in the sand, an old, weathered helmet with a name still faintly visible on the inside. The name was Hartwell. The summer of 1982 was cruel in the Mojave. Temperatures climbed high enough to split the earth, and even seasoned desert travelers knew better than to venture too far off the main highways. But the Jensen family, who had been camping near the Nevada border, preferred remote sites. They liked the quiet, the untouched stretches of land that felt older than civilization itself. That August, while their youngest boy dug in the sand near a low ridge, his shovel hit something hard. At first he thought it was just stone, but when he brushed the surface clean, the unmistakable curve of a steel helmet emerged. It was dented, weathered, and half filled with sand. The paint had long since peeled, but faint markings remained. On the inside, scrawled in black ink, was a name. Though faded, it was still readable. Hartwell. The Jensens turned it over to the nearest sheriff's office, who in turn notified Fort Irwin. Within days, Army investigators arrived and confirmed what the family already suspected. The helmet matched the standard issue given to Specialist First Class David Hartwell before his disappearance in 1969. But what was most unnerving was its location. The helmet had been found nearly 30 miles northeast of where the abandoned tank had been recovered in 1978. Hartwell could not have simply dropped it there by accident, and the condition of the helmet was odd. The metal was corroded, yes, but not nearly as much as one would expect after more than a decade exposed to desert heat and sandstorms. The straps were intact, the lining only slightly brittle, as though it had been left in the open for a few years at most, not 13. The Army's response was swift but secretive. The area around the ridge was quietly sealed off for 2 weeks while survey teams scoured the desert floor. Officially, nothing else was recovered. Unofficially, whispers trickled out from locals who claimed they had seen unmarked helicopters hovering low at night, shining searchlights into gullies and ravines. Once again, the official line was silence. The Army issued no statement. The Jensen family was told their find was being cataloged for historical record, but word had already spread in small-town papers. For those who remembered the story of the ghost tank from 4 years earlier, the discovery of Hartwell's helmet stirred new fascination. Letters poured into the Barstow Desert Dispatch, speculating on everything from government black sites to supernatural forces. What most people didn't know, however, was that Major Paul Donovan, the Army investigator who had pursued the case against orders in 1978, had reappeared in the Mojave earlier that same year. A former colleague later recalled that Donovan had spoken obsessively about the cliffside where Hartwell's tracks had ended. He was convinced something was hidden within those rocks. In March 1982, Donovan drove into the desert alone with maps, cameras, and supplies. He told no one officially. He never returned. His Jeep was later found abandoned near Sema Road, its tires half buried in sand. Inside were food, water, and neatly folded maps. The ignition keys were still in place, just as Hartwell's had been inside the tank. Donovan himself was gone, without a trace. When the Jensen family's helmet discovery surfaced months later, some within the Army quietly connected the dots. But no official statement linked Donovan's disappearance to Hartwell's mystery. Donovan was listed as missing, presumed dead, another life claimed by the unforgiving Mojave. By late 1982, rumors spread like wildfire among veterans and locals alike. Some said the helmet had been planted deliberately, just as many believed the tank had been staged years earlier. Others claimed it was evidence Hartwell had survived for some time after the tank vanished, wandering the desert before meeting some unknown fate. But the most unsettling whispers came from those who swore the desert itself seemed to swallow men whole. One man, a retired trucker named Leonard Briggs, told a Barstow reporter that back in 1975 he had pulled off Highway 15 one night to rest. He remembered seeing strange lights flickering in the distance. Not like headlights or campfires, but pulsing, bluish glows that shimmered against the desert floor. They seemed to move in patterns, almost like machinery at work. Briggs dismissed it at the time as exhaustion, until years later when he read about Hartwell. He swore the lights had come from near Ivampa Valley, not far from where the tank was found. Another local, a miner who spent decades prospecting around the Clark Mountains, told investigators he once heard the distinct grind of heavy machinery underground late at night. He described it as the sound of engines and gears echoing through rock, but when he searched the area by daylight, there was nothing, no tunnels, no shafts, no tracks, just silence. Though dismissed by officials, these accounts seemed to align disturbingly with Donovan's private theory that something was hidden beneath the desert floor, near the very bluff where Hartwell's tank tracks had ended. The case might have faded into obscurity if not for what happened in 1983. That spring, two hikers exploring near the New York mountains reported stumbling across a weathered metal canteen half buried in a dry creek bed. Etched faintly on its side were initials. DH inside the canteen was a scrap of paper, curled and brittle. Forensic examination later revealed faint writing, barely legible. Two words were decipherable. Still here. The Army quickly seized the canteen and sealed the report. But by then, whispers of its existence had already leaked. To the public, these fragments, the helmet, the canteen, painted a picture that was as disturbing as it was inconclusive. Had Hartwell somehow survived in the desert for years after the tank's disappearance? If so, why had no one ever seen him? Why leave behind cryptic messages, only to vanish again? And what of Donovan, who had disappeared chasing the same trail? By the mid-1980s, Hartwell's story had transformed into something larger than a missing soldier. Among veterans, he became almost mythic, a cautionary tale whispered late at night, a story of a man who drove a tank into the desert and was consumed by it. Locals called him the ghost operator. Truckers swapped stories of seeing hulking shadows moving across ridges at night, shapes too large to be trucks or jeeps, gliding silently under the moon. One particularly chilling account came from a highway patrol officer in 1985. While parked near Nipton, he claimed he saw a massive silhouette crest a ridge in the distance, backlit by the setting sun. At first he thought it was a low-flying aircraft, but then he realized it moved on tracks, a lumbering machine like a tank. He reached for his binoculars, but by the time he raised them, the figure was gone. The report was filed, then buried. By 1986, Hartwell's mother, who had never stopped writing letters demanding answers, passed away without ever learning what had happened to her son. She died convinced he was still alive somewhere in the desert, waiting to come home. That same year, a journalist named Caroline Hayes began digging into the story. Hayes was known for chasing obscure military mysteries, and the Hartwell case caught her attention when she stumbled across Donovan's name in an unrelated file. She traced the story through whispers, veterans' accounts, and dusty archived reports. In 1987, she published a feature in a small investigative magazine titled The Tank That Vanished. The piece connected the dots between Hartwell's disappearance, the recovery of the tank, Donovan's vanishing, and the helmet and canteen discoveries. Though written carefully, it hinted at suppressed evidence, classified files, and the possibility that Hartwell's fate was tied to something far stranger than desertion. The article gained little mainstream traction, but among conspiracy circles, it became gospel. Some claimed Hartwell had driven the tank into a secret underground facility. Others insisted he had stumbled across classified weapons tests, silenced for what he saw. A smaller, more superstitious group whispered that the Mojave itself was cursed, a place where machines and men were swallowed whole and spat back out years later. By the end of the decade, one chilling fact remained. No matter how much evidence surfaced, no trace of Hartwell himself was ever found. Not his body, not his bones, not a single confirmed sighting. Only fragments, scattered like breadcrumbs across the desert, each one raising more questions than answers. And in 1989, as if to remind everyone that the story was not finished, a road crew repairing a stretch of Highway 15 unearthed something buried beneath the asphalt. It was a military dog tag, bent and corroded, stamped with a name that by then had become legend. David Hartwell. The discovery of David Hartwell's dog tag in the summer of 1989 should have closed the case. After 20 years of unanswered questions, after the rumors, the staged silence, and the eerie fragments of evidence scattered across the Mojave, here at last was a piece of him. But instead of ending the mystery, it deepened it in ways no one expected. The tag had been found during roadwork on Interstate 15, just a few miles outside Baker, California. Workers digging to lay new asphalt hit something metallic in the soil. At first they assumed it was scrap from old construction, but when they rinsed it clean, the lettering became visible. The name Hartwell, D., was stamped clearly into the steel. The find was officially logged and handed over to authorities. But those who handled it noticed something strange. The metal, though bent, was not nearly as corroded as one would expect after 2 decades buried beneath desert soil. The chain was still intact. It was almost as if it had been placed there only a few years before the crew uncovered it. The Army retrieved the tag within days, thanking the road crew with polite formality and offering no further comment. But the rumors spread quickly. Some said the tag was planted deliberately to keep the story alive, as if Hartwell himself was leaving a trail long after he should have been dead. Others wondered if it was meant as a warning or a message. Among those who refused to let the case die was journalist Caroline Hayes, the same writer who had published The Tank That Vanished in 1987. When she learned of the dog tag, she drove out to Baker to interview the road workers. They all told her the same thing. The tag looked too clean, too recent, to have been in the dirt since 1969. One worker swore he had smelled something strange when he first pulled it out, a sharp, oily scent like burned fuel clinging to the metal. Hayes tried to press the Army for answers, filing requests under the Freedom of Information Act. Each time, she received heavily redacted pages, filled with black bars where meaningful words should have been. One file she obtained referenced a Hartwell anomaly in connection with Fort Irwin, but offered no context. Another contained photographs of the recovered tank in 1978, but each image was marred by blotches, like someone had deliberately damaged the negatives before release. By 1990, Hartwell's story had become something of an obsession for Hayes. She spoke to veterans, to truckers, to desert prospectors who claimed to have seen strange shapes moving across the sands late at night. The stories were consistent enough to disturb her. They all described the same thing: a hulking silhouette, larger than any vehicle that should have been out there, gliding across ridges or washes in silence. Always at dusk or night. Always gone by morning. One veteran, a man named Harold Kent, who had trained at Fort Irwin in 1971, described something that chilled Hayes. During a night exercise, he and his unit had heard a low rumble in the distance, the kind of vibration only a tank could make. But when they called it in, command insisted no tank was scheduled for movement in that area. Kent swore he saw a shape against the moonlit horizon, the turret turning slowly, as if surveying the desert. Then it vanished into the darkness. His commanding officer later told him to forget what he saw. In 1991, Hayes returned to the rocky bluff where Hartwell's original tank tracks had ended back in 1969. She brought with her a geologist from UCLA, hoping to examine the cliffside indentation that Major Donovan had once suspected concealed something. The geologist confirmed the rock bore signs of disturbance, not natural erosion, but something that looked as though machinery had once cut into it. He even suggested that beneath the cliff might lie hollow chambers or caves, the sort that could conceal heavy equipment. 3 weeks after her visit, Hayes began receiving anonymous letters at her Los Angeles office. Each contained short messages typed on plain paper. The first read, "Stop digging." The second, "You won't like what you find." The third contained only one phrase, "Still moving." Hayes, unnerved but undeterred, continued her investigation. She contacted retired Major Donovan's family, hoping to learn more about his 1982 disappearance. They told her Donovan had left behind a notebook filled with his thoughts about the Hartwell case. The Army had seized most of his belongings, but one page had been overlooked. It contained a single sentence written in hurried pen. "The desert doesn't just hide him, it keeps him." Hayes' reporting culminated in 1992 when she published a second article titled "The Ghost in the Mojave." This piece laid out the timeline of Hartwell's disappearance, the recovery of the tank, the helmet, the canteen, the dog tag, and the strange vanishing of Major Donovan. She included testimonies from locals who described silent tanks gliding across the desert, lights flickering underground, and the eerie feeling that something enormous was always just beyond sight. The article attracted more attention than her first, but it also drew backlash. Within weeks of its release, Hayes claimed she was followed by unmarked vehicles and received threatening phone calls at night. She described the voices as calm, almost rehearsed, telling her to leave the past buried. Then, in March of 1993, Hayes herself disappeared. She was last seen driving toward Barstow to meet a source who promised her new information about Hartwell. Her car was later found abandoned on a dirt road near the Clark Mountains. The keys were still in the ignition. Her notes were gone. She was never seen again. By then, the Hartwell story had passed fully into legend. Among truckers and desert wanderers, tales spread of the Phantom Tank, a machine that prowled the Mojave at night, leaving no tracks, its engine silent. Some said Hartwell was still inside, ageless, cursed to drive endlessly. Others whispered that he had stumbled onto something, a secret facility, an experiment, and that the Army itself had covered it up, silencing anyone who got too close. But the strangest twist came years later, in 1998. A hiker exploring an abandoned mine shaft near Ivampa Valley claimed to have found strange carvings on the rock wall deep inside. Scratched crudely into the stone were words that, though faint, were still legible. They read, 11 down, still moving. Hartwell. No one has ever verified the carving. The hiker refused to reveal the shaft's location, fearing the Army would seal it. But the story spread, feeding the legend further. As the decades passed, the Mojave kept its secrets. The desert swallowed evidence, silenced witnesses, and blurred the line between fact and folklore. Yet pieces of Hartwell's story continue to surface, fragments too specific, too consistent to dismiss. A helmet here, a canteen there, a dog tag under asphalt, each appearing not where it should, but where it unsettled most. Today, more than 50 years after that June morning in 1969, the disappearance of Specialist First Class David Hartwell remains one of the most baffling unsolved cases in American military history. No official explanation has ever been given. No body has ever been found. And yet, across the Mojave, truckers still claim to see shadows on ridges that are too large to be trucks. Hikers swear they hear low, distant rumbles with no source. One story, told quietly among Fort Irwin veterans, lingers strongest. In 2001, during a training exercise, a group of recruits claimed they saw an old M60 Patton cresting a ridge at dusk. The tank was weathered, sun-bleached, its paint peeling. They said it moved slowly, deliberately, its turret turning as if scanning the horizon. By the time instructors arrived, it was gone. The desert was empty, silent, undisturbed. When the recruits returned to their barracks that night, they found a scrap of metal placed neatly on one of their bunks. A fragment of a dog tag, stamped with 5 letters. Art. To this day, no one can say with certainty what happened to Specialist Hartwell. Whether he deserted, whether he stumbled into something he was never meant to find, or whether the Mojave itself swallowed him whole. But what remains undeniable is this. The tank came back. The helmet came back. The canteen came back. The dog tag came back. Hartwell himself never did. And yet, if you drive deep enough into the desert at night and you roll down your window, some swear you can still hear it, the faint, unnatural rumble of treads against stone. A tank still moving, forever lost in the Mojave.